Good evening and welcome to this new Bloodaxe International launch event. Tonight we're going to have three poets who are American or with American connections, and a fourth that we're paying tribute to. We have Thomas Lynch, renowned American poet and undertaker, who's here at the moment from Ireland. We have Andre Naffis-Sahely, who will tell you about himself shortly, who originally is from Abu Dhabi, but latterly has been living in California. And we have Anne Rouse, who grew up in Washington, DC, but has lived in Britain since the mid-70s, and she's in the south coast of England. And we're also going to be paying tribute to the late Tony Hoagland, and we're publishing posthumously his last book, Turn Up the Ocean. So I'll introduce the poets in turn. They'll each read for 7 to 8 minutes, and then they'll read again in the same order. And at the end of that, we'll have a video of Tony Hoagland reading a couple of his earlier poems. Unfortunately, of course, because we're publishing this last book posthumously, there aren't any recordings of him reading from the new book. So we're going to start with Andre Naffis-Sahely. This is his new book, his second collection, High Desert. His first collection was published by Penguin, and he calls it a psychedelic journal of end times and ode to the American Southwest. And you'll hear how that applies very, very shortly. A lot of the poems relate to Southwest America and events there, the wildfires, things to do with class and discrimination, nationalism, the Spanish colonial era, loads of stuff, as well as the recent pandemic. Andre was born, as I say, born in Venice, of Italian and Iranian parents. He grew up in Abu Dhabi, and since then he's lived and wandered around the world, ending up in California. But he also currently is the new poetry editor of Poetry London. So Andre, if you'd like to start.
Thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad to be reading for you tonight. It's a real honor to be on the Bloodaxe list. Yeah, I suppose I should begin by saying that, obviously I lived after leaving Abu Dhabi, I lived in the UK for well over a decade, but then moved to the US about 8 years ago in order to be with my partner, who was American. Although we spent a little bit of time on the East Coast, specifically in New York, around about 2016, when we felt the election results were kind of looming on the horizon, we decided to do a very American thing, and we packed what few belongings we had into our car and drove out west to California to give things a try there. And I remember, this is going to sound like a bit of a bad country song, but we were in Amarillo, Texas, and we stopped at a place called Carhenge, which was where they planted these Cadillacs kind of head face down into the ground and used them as canvases to, produce some paintings on them. And I remember there was a German family there with pink neon cowboy boots and leopard print cowboy hats. And I remember thinking, surely I'm going to try and avoid writing a book about the Southwest, especially being a bit of a tourist there. And here it is, actually. So it's a project that basically drew my attention quite early, because living in California, and then on our time off and our summers off, we would drive around the Southwest. I realized that there were lots of stories, mostly from about a century ago, like Neil said, dealing with class struggles, racial struggles, that weren't really talked about. I feel like there's still this idea in America that the West is this wild frontier place that doesn't have much of a history for a variety of reasons. And so the idea was to try and bring some of these stories into the poems. And I wanted to read the title poem just to start us off. And it's called High Desert. Time to listen to my bones, to seek a stillness known only to deserts. Pause, traveler, and behold this empire of absences, the snowy salt beds of vanished lakes, the outlines of decommissioned railroads, the petroglyphs of people murdered long ago, and all around, nearly limitless stretches of cottonwood, willow, and mesquite tufting out of the sand. All day, I drive along mummified freeways, from Amboy to Zizix, and zip past Cadiz, Baghdad, and Siberia in under an hour's time. These are the ghost towns of America's Main Street, an unbroken montage of smokestacks, silhouettes of sidewalks, the boarded remains of small businesses. There is no better backdrop for the mirage of permanent boom times than the desert, a landscape where, despite claims to the contrary, no town was too tough to die. Once genocide had cleared the country, and extractionist lust was unleashed on the West. The blunt simplicity of place names, a shrine to these seekers' obsessions. Carbondale, Copperopolis, Oroville, Petrolia. Spartan mockeries of models and morals left behind and forgotten. Towns where the sheriffs robbed trains at gunpoint or smuggled liquor across the border, only to blame it on the Mexicans. Next to no sign now of the old tribes, the trappers, the pioneers, yet no shortage of jackrabbit meth labs, tin cans, rusted lawn chairs, gas stations, and fall 50s diners. Dead or alive, each one of them greets me with the same sign, the same 4 planks of wood. Name, date of establishment, elevation, and population. The latter always in the single or double digits. Exhausted, I lie down on the sand and warm my feet by the embers of this final frontier, and consider how strange it is that it's here where, after decades of rootlessness, I abandon all cravings for permanence. So that was High Desert, and it's I thought I'd follow it up just to include this first part with one of the earlier poems I wrote for the book. And this was written when I was staying in Cochise County in southeastern Arizona, not too far north of the town of Bisbee. And this is the summer of 2018. And it's called Roadrunners. In the pink light, halos of cloud form over the mountains. Lightning 2 valleys away. Then, not an hour later, the explosion of thunder. The roadrunners pecking for breadcrumbs on the porch have long since fled into the endless ocean of grass. Driving in every direction down licks of red road, I have lost myself in a militarized topography. Everything named after army units, generals, scouts, miners. The Dragoon Mountain, Cochise Stronghold, defunct Gleason and Pierce, weird rusty ghost towns, the only non-derelict structure for miles, the local school. Its polished windows and well-kept lawn, a source of great local pride. No mountain monograms for these desiccated whistle stops. No giant Q or C or W in bright white paint to mark the township's still functional, sort of functional breathing. No carving for them into the planet's bark. And thus, they are blessed to me like no other. Every successful city is a flimsy affair of civility. Its eternalness, like Paris or Rome, a slow march to desacralization. Make America great again. Buy real estate. Hail follows rain. Nearby, the township of Sunsites, once billed as the safest spot to survive the inevitable nuclear winter, actually topped Soviet Russia's list of high priority targets. Enter the orange duck candidate. A haboob sweeps across the valley of the senile, And in a week, the mountains have switched from brown to purple to green. The desert is human endeavor's most fitting graveyard. The slow bleaching, the gradual eroding into sand, the heat stifling sound as it leaps into the air. It can't happen here, but it always does. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Anne and from Thomas as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you for reading two of my favorite poems from your book. I hope you'll be able to slip in Welcome to America in the second part. Thank you. Anne. Now, Anne Rouse, I first came across her work in the late 80s when she sent me a manuscript towards the first collection, and Carol Rumens then included a selection of her work in her anthology, New Women Poets, in 1990. And Anne went on to publish her first collection, Sunset Grill, with Bloodaxe in 1993. Oxeye, her new book, is actually her fifth collection, but it appears 14 years after her previous book, The Upshot, which was a new and selected, including a new collection, as well as the three previous books. So we've not heard from Anne for quite a while, and I'm sure everyone will be delighted now to hear her reading from her new book, Oxeye. Anne.
Landfill. I'll start right in, and thank you very much, Neil, for this opportunity. And it was lovely to hear Andre's poems, and thank you very, very much to everyone for coming. It wasn't on the map, that spot we found. Dogs ran, whirling at their owners' shouts on the scrubby recreation ground. We skirted a wood of hopeful oaks and crossed a second copse to a green, a hidden field, revealing soon enough a manhole cover, rusted vents, that its lustrous grass, its collared doves, its tangled fringe of buddleia and Queen Anne's lace, rested on ravioli tins and rich tea packets. The hairline cracked, the chucked-in rage, the town's miasmic secrets, but mostly just on the indifferent residue of days, and walked it round as if its buried future were still ours. That was from the many walks I'm sure many people took in the last 2 years in my area of Hastings. Yes, I was really interested in the peopled landscape of and unpeopled landscapes of Andre's poems in the Southwest of America. This is rather different, Ballad of the She. Under the blade of the sun, I heard a confession. A daemon had said to a she, "Come lie with me, be only mine," and frayed into longing, she obeyed. Now, maiden, fly, take up your sack of joy. The merry rivers run, the tired thief is gone. Fling off as you find shelter, faces you used to wear. Damsel, sleeper, silent one, odalisque and mannequin, live out your truest word. This is what I heard, which was said and done under the blade of the sun. Yes, I've got a few feminist poems in Oxeye. It's just sort of the way it worked out. Night of the Monkey Puzzle Tree is, there's a tree outside the window here, and it sort of segues into history. Green ziggurat, it jigsaws the view with needle-tipped serrated boughs, lizard teeth, and outsized jaws, haunting the suburban present, a country beyond accident. The monkey's triumph currently, the Holocene age evolved between its scissor branches, book and screen, traffic growling up the ridge, began under a blackthorn hedge. Dwindling to whitened clemency, The slow night ends, its brawlers pale. Each flash of claw has left our sentinel unmarked and unimpressed, only loftier, rooted in gore, attempting the hereafter. Across its jagged workmen's weave, outriders of the sun prevail, and now the shadows send into the morning's reckoning through every baffled dream. Sorry, I misread that. And now the uneven shadows steal into the morning's reckoning through every baffled dream. Sorry, I'm not used to this zooming yet. Anyway, one more in this section. Grotto. An outsized conch shell blown by wealth by history's man. It glistens with its light cargo, washed up from planetary distances. Abalone, flute and fan, king crab, to the city wharves and set in water on this great estate by local girls who were nameless even then, and whose mosaic lines converge, unbroken mother of pearl, a giver's cup forever running over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I should have shown everyone Anne's beautiful book, which you can see, I hope. And now I'm going to show you Thomas Lynch's book. Now this cover shows the bone rosary, which is at the end of his garden overlooking the lake where he lives. And it's made of vertebrae, vertebrae which survives from his dog having eaten so many bones over the years, and he strung them together and made this extraordinary bone rosary, which Matthew Sweeney has written about as well, having visited him there. As I mentioned, Tom is renowned both as an undertaker and as a poet. He published, first of all, in this country with Jonathan Cape. The last collection to be published in the British Isles was with Salmon, and we're now very honoured to publish his new and selected poems. He read at Ledbury Poetry Festival in 2017, which is when I saw him last in the flesh. And one of the poems he read there was called Refusing to Write Sonnets at 52. And I was so taken by that I asked him whether I could include it in my anthology, Staying Human, which took a couple more years to come out. It came out in 2020. And that initiated contact between us and with his American publisher. And so we're delighted to be able to publish this book, Bone Rosary, here, which came out in the States last year. His ancestral home is in County Clare, and that's where he is this evening talking to us from. So, Tom, it's your slot now.
Thank you very much, Neil. And indeed, thanks to you and to everyone at Bloodaxe for bringing this new and selected edition into being. It's very good to see what amounts to 30 or 40 years of work sort of gathered together, and I'm deeply grateful to Bloodaxe for doing so. I'll take the opportunity, because I am in Moveen and County Clare at the edge of between the ocean and the estuary. Rarely do we get a chance to read a poem that was made on the day 10 years earlier in the place that we were 10 years earlier and turn up again. And we get to read it to the virtual reality of Zoom and YouTube. So a lot of things have happened virtually in the last few years. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to read this poem called Moveen Solstice. Bees abound in the Rosa rugosa, wildly overgrown. The Oleria wants cutting back, the haggards mowing. The whitethorn hedge and alder should be pruned, the chimney swept, cow cabins shoveled out, and doors left open because it's June and the sweet breath of Cuba in the air has made its ocean crossing finally in counterclockwise northeast orbitings. To wash ashore a few fields north of here, its warm anointing inundating through gaps and gates, cross ditches, over walls, among springers and weanlings, mares and foals, shorthorns, Frisians, Charolais, Belgian blues, whilst JJ and Sonny talk silage and prices, the shape of the weather, and Damien is whitewashing the garden wall, and Mora, golden in late light, brings the dry linens in. Whenever I read that poem, I'm reminded of the fact that in 10 years, everyone in it has died. And the catalog of losses that we have suffered as a community, a culture, a globe, through the recent pestilence has overwhelmed our medical infrastructure, our financial infrastructure, our civic infrastructure, certainly our mortuary infrastructure. And it's so important that we keep doing things that try to reinitiate the normal, including the normal celebration of language, which poetry readings are and the publication of poetry is. One of the poems that Andre read made me want to read this. It's called Franchise 2016. It's in 3 sections. So 63% of white men spent their franchise on a fellow like themselves who hadn't a chance and only ran because the system's rigged against us. The likes of us can't get a break. What with the immigrants, dishonest media, the welfare cheats, we want it back the way it was before fake news and feminazis and the queers, before the Kenyan Antichrist. 8 years of hope and change, enough's enough. 8 years of step and fetching to a tune called by a Muslim's quite enough, thank you. What we need now is some relief. We want it told just like it is. Enough PC. We want a wall. We're not about to chance it on some nasty woman who thinks she's smarter than us all. Don't get us wrong. We're all for the ladies, just not this one. Not now. Maybe next time, maybe not. Let's make America great again. Old white guys got us this far after all. 2. And Christian evangelicals turned out, some 81% of them for Trump, because their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was crucified to save old billionaires from political correctness and the poor, who should have made a seed faith offering or said more prayers or spoken tongues, and who ought not be given fish but taught to fish. What's more, they should be extremely vetted, banned and banished if they're here illegally. Did you hear the one about the 2 Corinthians who walk into a bar to have a beer? The barkeep says, "We don't serve your kind here. We only cater to real Americans, you know, God-fearing, good news gospel sorts, foot soldiers in the war on Christmas, true believers, belongers, triumphalists. No migrants, Mexicans or Syrians, unless they're on the lamb from Bethlehem. God's on our side. We're wholly innocent." 3. And I want to say, I think my generation and the ones adjacent it, history will show the biggest mistake we ever made was not seizing the opportunity to elect a woman president in 2016. That we went in her stead to elect a corrupt ignoramus is over and again the biggest mistake we've made. 3, some 53% of white women cast their votes they cast for that vile man because Benghazi, or deleted emails, or else because the lesser of evils. What makes her think a woman ever can be leader of the free world? Get a clue. It's better to leave well enough alone. They all turned out to march on Washington with sister marches all across the globe and held their higher ground and boldly strode to say that women's rights were human rights and equal pay for equal work. Some might have wondered why we hadn't marched before, why 40-some% forgot to vote. But still, I thought, we're all in this together. So donned my marching boots, dressed for the weather, hoisted up a sign that said, "Come, tread with me," then walked the dog up Temple Road alone. Some women go for guys who march with them, still more with those who grab them by the pussy. And finally, her jams of various berries for Suzanne Rumsey, a Canadian theologian. The photos with her brimming buckets full, cardboard boxes, baskets of blueberries, fall raspberries, plump June strawberries, grinning in her Guatemalan overalls, make manifest the undeservedness essential to the mysteries of love. Such evident abundance, nonetheless, a metaphor for offering oneself as curates do at Eucharistic feasts, which shares an etymology with grace and gratitude, all liturgies of thanks, these open arms, this beckoning embrace, chrismy fingers, gifts of tongues and taste between the carnal and the incarnate. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I think that sounds like a cue for Andre to come in and welcome everyone to America. Andre.
Thank you, Neil. And really wonderful to hear your poems, Anne and Thomas. It's such a treat. And yeah, I'll read Welcome to America, which I think originally really was called What the Immigration Officer Told Me. And Neil was very kind to include it, even though I submitted it probably a little quite late into the process after we already started working on the book. But anyway, it's called Welcome to America. Let's start again from the top. Nothing you told me sounds true. I've looked at your passport and there are too many stamps. What kind of man calls himself cosmopolitan? You're ruthless and dangerous. I've printed out your poems and essays, and I want an answer right now. What are you doing here? Love isn't a reason, and neither is wanderlust. Why would she want you? Can you make enough money? I like thrillers and mysteries and plots with a point. Look around you. This country's too generous. We're filled to capacity. See that old man in the wheelchair? He's been here for days, and you'll be here longer. I'm late for lunch as it is, and if it was up to me, I'd send you straight back. So that was Welcome to America. That was in Florida, actually, that happened. The next poem I wanted to read doesn't need much in the way of an introduction apart from, it's called Ode to the Errant King. And the king mentioned in that poem is Imru al-Qais, one of the great pre-Islamic poets, whose work I've loved my whole life. And it was written in collaboration. Well, it was part of this collaboration that I worked on with the visual artist, Yemeni artist Alia Ali, who was working on a series of responses to events in 2018 when families were separated at the border. And so she invited me to write this poem. And I think this ties in, earlier Thomas mentioned the catalog of loss of the past few years. And I think the very opening line from this poem is taken from a poem by Imru al-Qais, who is essentially called the Wandering Prince because he was, his throne was taken away from him at a young age, even though he was supposed to succeed his father, who was the king of a southern Arabian kingdom. And he went all the way to Constantinople to seek the aid of the Byzantine emperor. And he made the fatal mistake of falling in love with the emperor's daughter. And when the Byzantine emperor found out that Imre Kayes had been having an affair with his daughter, instead of confining him or having him killed right on the spot, he decided to call him in for an audience, and he gave him a beautiful present, this beautiful cloak, and then sent him on his way. And so the story goes, about halfway through his return journey back to his father's kingdom, Imre Kayes puts on this beautiful cloak and dies because the cloak was poisoned. So that was the emperor's revenge. And this is called Ode to the Errant King. Stop, my friends, and we shall weep over the memory of a loved one, or thousands, or millions. Who can keep track anymore? Remember this, that the only oath a promised land keeps is to make you suffer. And these days, every blanket bestowed, every morsel of food, every mouthful of water is another buck in the bank. Long gone is the lamp that lit the golden door. There are only walls and chain link fences and mylar. Why mylar? Envision its sheen, the deceptive strength of that metallized film. Imagine it used for warmth in the cold damp of prisons. What do you see in its mirror-like surface, if not the face of a monster? What is a human observed through the slits of a cage? Can you still call them human? What is a great global city, a great country, whatever that is, without an island of tears, a terminal of surrender? What is life, if not Imru's poisoned cloak, beautiful to behold, deadly to wear? Enduring wrongs endure, nothing changes, and so tell me why I still believe in the journey. Moving is hope, and it shushes the mind and fills the heart with something other than fear. Mylar, Melanex, Hostafan, names that provide the illusion of comfort and safety, of guiltlessness. Is a prison still a prison if the inmates have Xboxes? What sadder use could there be for that foil and its interstellar potential? Whatever became of solar sails, whatever happened to us? Consider the border, any border. If a border is a war zone, then what do the insides of our consciousness look like? Therein lies a barrenness to rival any desert, and soon that desert will drink what is left of the sea. Consider also the sky. Bloodthirsty Mars beckons. How far do you think we will travel before we rediscover our bond? How many rocks and stars shall we visit before we remember we're human? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andre. We're getting some interesting comments coming through. Jessica Trainer says, good to see you, Thomas. Looking forward to the new poems. Shash Trevitt says, brilliant political poems. Theo Smiley says, wonderful readings, loving the political and feminist poems, which might be a cue now for Anne to read her second set of poems.
Right.
We can hear you.
Of course, now that you've kindly said that, I've actually got sort of slightly more personal, but you know, they used to say a long time ago that personal is political, so good excuse. Hello, darling. I was proud of that. A year had passed. The visitation felt abrupt. A hose stream eddied down Ashburnham Hill, ran coldly on, relentlessly ad hoc. The families toiled up from the church school. I heard your answering voice above a lorry's sliding bass, its gruffest note sustained. What oscillates is us. Okay, well, that's an Old Flame poem, so I've decided only to give the Old Flame one poem on this occasion. And the other one, very different. There are two more, but the next one, To the Night Market. on a more somber note. I've been on this road or one like it. In the dark, it's a gray outline. Potholed macadam underfoot, curving on to the vanished town. On the way to the night market, the thin laughter rises like the wisps from cigarettes when I ask, what place is this? I wander between square and station, between station and square, until a voice says, yes, love, revealing the original pair in close-knit cap and cockeyed trilby, sitting on a step, and I lead them away to lit warrens where the glad buffet awaits on long tables and shades retreat that we might stay and eat. And another one on that same, unfortunately, I had COVID affected my father in America. And, you know, like so many, I wasn't able to be there. Anyway, the last poem, Return to Cinder. It's a no man's land, rusted side gate, gully of last year's leaves and briars, grey orioles of dandelions, sentinels against the neighbours' stucco and rose. I wait for the greetings to wash over me. A moth beats flimsy against the entry light. Brown water rots in the terraces, troughs and urns. I can smell its marshy stagnancy. Then I'm like the prodigal's brother, railing at the vines. Why is this wasted death so welcome here? I go to the feast eventually and wonder at the conjurers, their daylight getaway. They sweep out, their sequined trains trailing in the rutted driveway to the wooded road as love, like a stooping bodyguard, walks with them to the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And before we hear from Tom's last set, just like to say, if you have any questions or comments, do put them in the chat. And when we have our in discussion, in conversation section at the end, we'll see whether we take up some of those. Also, if you want to get hold of any of the books, if you scroll down on the YouTube page, you'll find links to buy them from there. So now we're going to hear Tom's second set.
Thanks, Neil. And thanks, Anne and Andre. It's a real honor to be reading with you and to be, yeah, it's a real honor. Thank you. This is a poem called Another Miracle. Many of you will know Heaney's poem based on the story of the paralytic healed at Capernaum. And he talks about the paralytic being lowered through the roof to the foot of his healer and redeemer. And I thought as much when I attended Heaney's funeral and hitched a ride in the hearse with his corpse from Donnybrook to Balahi. And then it was about a 3-hour trip, but watching them lower him on ropes into the grave, it put me in mind of that episode that had so affected his own thinking. Another miracle. School children from the Anahore school in green gym slips and ganzis lined the way in honor at the churchyard in Balahi. Sons and brothers shouldered the coffin up toward the corner and the open ground beneath the sycamores beside the brother. I walked behind with the widow and daughter, still thinking this was all a grave mistake, but they carried on. The priests had their say. The piper played and then they lowered him. much like the paralytic in Capernaum, on ropes to be forgiven and then healed. We all took up our mats and walked away, having never seen a thing like that before. And though I've been abstemious for a good few years now, I spend a lot of time in public houses because certainly in this parish, you wouldn't know what was going on unless you spent a portion of every day in the pub. It's where you get your mail and messages and all the best rumors and codswallop. So this is a poem called In the Gents' Loo of the Stella Maris. The Stella Maris is a bar and hotel and restaurant in Kilkee that overlooks the Strand. Martin Hawk, its proprietor, it's his birthday today. So Martin, whatever else, happy birthday. Go for the 100. There's a slight discount if you make it. In the Gents' Loo of the Stella Maris. Armitage shanks emblazoned on porcelain unfailingly focused the eye of his mind on the pissers in Pierce Fennell's Anchor Bar in Carrigaholt 40-some years before. The screeching of jackdaws and hovering gulls, the river flushing itself into the sea, Pierce holding forth with that wary Alsatian growling on the floor, and me in a blur consigning the pints I was after downing to the wall and the sluice drain and the great unseen confluence of all things whereby everything, time and life, happenstance, love and memory, all in capitals and sudden clarity, wove themselves into a manifest union, the nature of which remained just out of reach. Possibly he had had too much to drink, or maybe the light beaming over the transom and the day that was in it turning to gold infused him with such permanent gratitude that here in his 60s, sober and grinning, what he could say is that he'd had enough. Hitch his trousers up and make for the way home. I should revise that to read 70s now, but be that as it may. I'll finish with a poem stolen both from a poem referenced before by Heaney and from an image. The last time I was in London before the pestilence struck, I made my way to the Wellcome collection to get a look at this image, an engraving done in the late 18th century of that episode involving what does it say? The sick of the palsy is healed and his sins forgiven. We all know the story, but that title is a reversal of the order in which it happens in the text of the Bible. First, his sins are forgiven, and then as sort of a chaser for that miracle, which is unseen, Jesus heals him, he gets up and walks away. And so I have named this poem, The Sick of the Palsy is Healed and His Sins Forgiven. And again, thank you for the real pleasure of reading with you two. The graver's title tells it in reverse. So, which the greater miracle were asked? To cleanse the soul or cure paralysis? The mercy hidden or made manifest? The King James Version has forgiveness first, the sins remission quite invisible, and then to quiet the scribes and Pharisees, arise, he says, take up your bed and walk. Wherefore begrudgers and their begrudging talk of blasphemy and sacrilege are hushed. The palsied man stands up and saunters off, bedroll and ropes gathered under his arm. Behold, we never saw a thing like that. The Savior's plain on this. It's faith that saves. The boyos on the roof, like pallbearers, delivered of their corpse and coffin straps, their thankless jobs all heft and heave and lift, done for yet another day. So they begin taking up their shovels, sods, and tiles to mend the mess they've made of it again.
Thank you very much, Tom. Now, before we go to the video of Tony Hoagland, I'd like to ask Anne, Andre, and Tom to switch off their videos. Otherwise, you will appear alongside Tony Hoagland. So if you can just click off your videos. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Now, I mentioned before the importance of Ledbury Poetry Festival to publishing Thomas Lynch. I'd read his books before, I had his books, I loved his work. I didn't know until he read at Ledbury that he no longer had a publisher. So I was delighted afterwards to be able to take up his work and publish it here. Now, another festival was responsible for Bloodaxe publishing Tony Hoagland, which was Aldeburgh Poetry Festival. They brought him over in 2005. I hadn't read his work beforehand, but they alerted me to this, and I got hold of copies of his books, and I loved his work so much that I published his first UK selection, What Narcissism Means to Me, one of many great titles. And after that, Bloodaxe went on to publish 4 more collections, including this latest one. In 2008, I was on Cape Cod with my wife, Pamela Robertson Pierce, a filmmaker, and we took the opportunity to visit Tony there in Wellfleet and film him reading some of his poems, which are available in the film footage. Full film footage is available in the In-Person World Poets DVD book anthology. So we've got 2 of those poems for you to hear him, watch him reading tonight. They were both later published in a collection which came out in 2010 called Unincorporated Persons in the Late Honda Dynasty. But he was reading those poems then from manuscript, and there were some changes in the poems from when he read them until so that they appear differently in various respects in the book. And I'll say something about that at the end before we go into the discussion. We've had a lot of beautifully ironic poems tonight, and Tony was known as America's high priest of irony as far as poetry was concerned. So I hope you'll enjoy seeing him back in 2008, reading 2 of his poems to us on Cape Cod. So we'll now see the video.
This is a poem called Romantic Moment. And the situation of the poem is that 2 people who are dating have gone on a date to see one of those nature documentaries in which a sort of BBC or PBS narrator describes the mating habits of various mammals and other animals in anthropomorphic terms. And so the 2 people on the date have seen this film, and it's affected their subjectivity. And the poem is called Romantic Moment. After seeing the nature documentary, we walk down Canyon Road onto the plaza of art galleries and high-end clothing stores, where the mock orange is fragrant in the summer night and the smooth adobe walls glow flesh-like in the dark. It is just our second date, and we sit down on a bench, holding hands, not looking at each other. And if I were a bull penguin right now, I would lean over and vomit softly into the mouth of my beloved. And if I were a peacock, I'd flex my gluteal muscles to erect and spread the quills on my Cinemax tail. If she were a female walking stick bug, she might insert her hypodermic proboscis delicately into my neck and inject me with a rich hormonal sedative before attaching her egg sac to my thoracic undercarriage. And if I were a young chimpanzee, I would break off a nearby tree limb and smash all the windows in the plaza jewelry stores. And if she was a Brazilian leopard frog, she would wrap her impressive tongue 3 times around my right thigh and pummel me lightly against the surface of our pond, and I would know her feelings were sincere. Instead, we sit a while in silence, until she remarks that in the relative context of tortoises and iguanas, human males seem to be actually rather expressive. And I say that female crocodiles really don't receive enough credit for their gentleness. And she suggests that it is time for us to go to get some ice cream cones and eat them. I tried to write a poem trying to get to the bottom of my feelings about Britney Spears, and in fact sort of trying to say what it is that she is, although she ultimately is a mystery. And so the poem begins with the title, which is the first line: "Poor Britney Spears," is not the beginning of a sentence you hear often uttered in my household. If she wants to make a career comeback, and her agent pushes her into the MTV Awards show, but she can't lose the weight beforehand, and so looks chubby in a spangled bikini before millions of fanged, spiteful fans and enemies, then gets a little drunk while getting her nerve up, so botches a step in the dance routine, which makes her look, one critic says, like a comatose piglet. Well, it wasn't by accident, was it, that she wandered into that glitterati party of late 20th century striptease celebrity? First, we made her into an object of desire, then into an object of contempt. Now, we want to nominate her as an object of compassion. Are you sure we know what the hell we're doing? Is she a kind of voodoo doll onto whom we vicariously project our fantasies of triumph and humiliation? Is she a life-size piece of chewing gum full of non-FDA approved additives, bioengineered and fed to us by the mad scientists of the mainstream dream machine? Or is she nothing less than a gladiatrix who stalks into the Colosseum full of blinding lights and tigers before a vast stadium of witnesses, with naught but her slim javelin of talent and recklessly little protective clothing? Oh, my adorable little monkey, prancing for your candy, with one of my voices I shout, "Jump, jump, you little whore." With another, I turn down the lights and say, "Put on some clothes and go home, sweetheart."
Right, I'd now like to ask our writers to click on their videos and take off their mutes so we can see everyone. Thank you very much. Before I turn to the poets to say a few things about Tony Hoagland, I'd just like to say how he was always rewriting his poems. And the first of those poems he read, Romantic Moment, is quite unusual because he changed the ending. So what you heard there was and she suggested it's time to get some ice cream cones and eat them. Now, when that appeared in the book 2 years later, then she suggests it's time for us to do something personal, hidden, and human, which is a completely different ending and sort of changes the end of the poem. But quite astonishingly, when he read the poem about 10 years later in readings, he went back to that original line about get some ice cream cones and eat them. So he completely reversed it back to what he started off with. Now, Tom, you read with Tony at Ledbury and you spent some time with him there. So I think you really get him. I'm wondering whether you could say something first about him and his work.
Well, I'm glad for the opportunity to say I didn't get him in the way he seemed to get the rest of us. He what I knew about Tony Hoagland before I got to Ledbury was that he was a sick man with cancer.
Yeah.
It didn't come up in our conversation much. And it's not because Tony had anything, Tony didn't live in denial. I just thought the level of his acceptance of mortality was so sort of deeply human that he just didn't think it was much of a conversation. We die, as Conrad Hilberry wrote in a poem for his dead daughter years ago. And that's the sum and substance of we are, and the numbers are convincing on this 100%. And Tony was so full of life up until the moment. Well, I can only speak to the time I was with him, but he was a dying man when I met him.
Mm.
He was fully alive when he was reading his poems. And afterwards, when we were arguing the difference between dialogue and monologue in poetry, he was fully engaged in the conversation. And yeah, he was a good man. And yeah, I was very chuffed to be there with him. When you sent this last book, the poem called Diagnosis is the one that I keep going back to. The first line being, "It's not that I need to tell everyone I meet I have cancer." And then he goes on to talk about all the things he shouldn't really do because he's got cancer. But it's, yeah, he at least from my standpoint, he showed me how to live as a responsible human with our mortality. So
as someone who's been close to death over so many years, being an undertaker, a funeral director, did you take anything from him in relation to that experience?
Well, what I mostly took is, like I say, this deep humanity, that death wasn't somehow a strange thing out there in the rosy future, that he would eventually outlive. He dealt with death in its truly demographic sense. He was going to be dead sooner than later, and he'd be dead longer than he was alive. And the best thing he could offer were these living documents that he was constantly revising, as you said. When he was reading poems, he was revising them.
Mm.
And you could, someone made nice recordings of our readings at Ledbury. And there was a responsorial aspect to those things. It was a kind of an ongoing conversation that we had started in a pub on the way to is it the Burgage Hall where they have those?
Yeah, it was the Burgage Hall.
Yeah. But I'm looking forward to being back there again in a couple weeks time, because there'll be good ghosts around the place for me, and Tony's chief among them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, his previous book was Priest Turned Therapist Treats Fear of God,
Yeah.
which are also his last poems, the last book he published before he died.
Yeah.
And this new book, they're both much mellower than his previous books. He was quite a cantankerous person. He was very ebullient. He could be very offensive in a very, Tony way. But in these last poems, he was much more mellow and forgiving, and wanting to kind of ask for forgiveness in a way, ask for all the people he might have offended to just, as you say, just treat him as a human being. And he was there giving testament to his mortality right to the end. These poems in the new book were discovered after his death by his wife, Kathleen Lee.
Yeah.
So we didn't actually know about them. We thought that the previous book was the last book, but then these poems turned up and she edited them into the manuscript that was then published in the States by Grey Wolf and by Bloodaxe at the same time. I wonder whether Anne and Andre want to come in on anything to do with Tony's work.
It was a real revelation to me, actually. I'd only read bits and pieces, and I thought he had wonderful timing, wonderful precision. I'm not sure it completely comes across in those two poems in the video, but there's a sort of informality, but at the same time, very, very witty and very, very observant. They're really turned on a dime, some of the poems. So yeah, I was impressed with that. Yeah, I would love to have met him.
Andre, anything?
Yeah, I was just catching up again with some poems from the book, and there was one that I loved in particular, because I suppose he didn't produce too many of them, but I think there's enough that they could make a chapbook of the sort of humorous historical poems, and this one's called The Decline of the Roman Empire, where he says Flaccus Timonius had the first heated toilet seat in District 11. Only other members of the Senate are invited to try it. And I think he just, as someone who has always been drawn by history, I think I've always appreciated how he was able to break through the noise, the echo of the centuries, and just always ground us in the brutality of the human condition. I think that poem he read about Britney Spears, it was quite moving, really, especially given, it reminds you of how we chuck people to the lions for mere entertainment, and I think that's something that it would have been difficult to write about from a certain point of view. And so I think, his powers will be missed, I think, really. There's something quite precious that he left behind in this body of work. Also lately, I feel like I've been reading some fantastic kind of unexpected books left behind by poets that no one knew they existed. One of the ones I read recently was Les Mary's Continuous Creation. No one knew that there was a book, and 4 years after his death, here we are. But yeah, it's a wonderful book, Front of the Ocean.
I thought some of his angles are really unusual. I was quoting one the other day called Safeway. I'm not absolutely sure if it's in this book. But it has sort of reference to sort of cereals, on a supermarket shelf is one sort of thing. And then there's one in the book where he's talking about and that, I should say, that supermarket shelf relates to his mother who was dying, and then he's in a kind of cancer ward or oncology unit, and he hones in on what all the men do. This one is talking loudly to his girlfriend. This one is, and then one is just comforting himself, talking to himself, really. And the way he puts it's very, very sharp and very, very moving at the same time. Yeah.
I think what Neil said about he had ceased getting into the kind of quarrels that he'd happily engage in for some time. I think part of the deep humanity that characterized his the end of his life is that time had become so precious, and that he just was not going to do any of the usual pissing matches that we're always finding time for in our usual life. But if we live as if we're going to be dead someday, we give up those pissing matches really quick. But since we're all going to be dead someday, the numbers are really convincing on this. I am here to tell you. We all could live with the same level of acceptance that really illuminated Tony Hoagland's last days, because the only quarrel he would abide anymore was the quarrel in Yeats's idea, the quarrel we have with ourselves, which makes poetry. He was through with rhetoric. He was through with the cheap speech of competition. He only was willing to quarrel with himself about what really matters. And I think we owe a debt to his surviving widow and to Bloodaxe and you, Neil, for bringing these last quarrels onto the page where they will, and this is the plan, outlive him. They will exist in libraries. People will study them 50 years from now. And this is the only reason why poets bother with this, because the money's not good. And everybody likes poetry the way they like clean drinking water. They just don't want to have to bother reading poems, you know? And but they do when the chips are down. It's the first section they go to, because poetry is sort of a raised speech, much like liturgy. The language achieves things in poetry that it doesn't in prose. Tony knew this, and why he made a long practice of this quarrel with himself. And I think we're all the better for it. And thanks be to whomever's in charge here that the record is kept. This is what publishers do better than anybody. They go out on the limb, because I'm not sure, but I'm just guessing that you're not going to retire on this book or any of ours. You're just going to keep doing this until it's over.
And I have to thank Grey Wolf in the States as well, who pioneered the publishing of his work there.
Yeah.
Let's turn now to your work, the three of you. We've had three very different perspectives tonight, two specifically on America and not so specifically, but you all have in common your social observation, your irony, all those elements. There's a lot of things that tie you together in terms of your work. Also, very interestingly, you're much more formal than a lot of poets. You're not necessarily using rhythm and rhyme, although you do, meter and rhyme. But sometimes the form is not that sort of out there, but it's there. It's the bodywork of the poem, if you like. So it's unusual that we have three poets who are so formally based in their work, I think, nowadays. I wonder whether any of you would like to come in on maybe the form aspect first.
I love listening to it, and I think actually that probably dictated some of my choices tonight, because I thought, what a great opportunity. People are forced to listen to formal poetry, not forced. Yeah, so that is something that always engages me a lot. I was listening to Jo Clement not long ago, who's just made her debut on Bloodaxe, and lovely formal poetry, and it's great to hear it, you know. I don't know, I just think it has a great, there's an emphasis that comes to it. You can really savor the words. I mean, there are other ways to write, but that's what appeals to me. So yes, I'm really enjoying that about this evening.
I'm remembering Michael Donaghy, who I traveled from London out to Cheltenham with on the train, and we were trading line after line. I think Sweeney was in the same car. And so we were having a right good time. And when it came time for Michael to present his poems to the audience at Cheltenham, he found that he had left his folio on the train. I think the line they use here is "drink had been taken," but I'm not sure. But the thing is, Michael's poems were so wrought that he knew them by heart. He just didn't know it until he got up there to say them. And then he would get into the same trance that form allows us to get into. And it is the trance where we remember making those diction choices, those word choices, those rhythm choices, whatever it happens to be. It is, as Anne says quite properly, it is something that happens in your ear. It's an acoustic thing. So, yeah.
Andre, like Heaney, you're fond of quatrains.
I am, but I think that was in the inheritance from a lot of the poets that I grew up reading, that I really admired. And I have to say, I think in a way, when it comes to the form, you know, I always end up making a bit of a parallel to translation, where I remember, you know, I spent a lot of time translating post-colonial writers who wrote in the colonial tongue, essentially. And I remember meeting the great Moroccan poet Abdelatif Lahabi, who said, you know, there was nothing sweeter in my life than using the language of the French against them. And there's something I think that carries across the form for me, where I think by being, let's say, a little more formal, perhaps a little more traditional, it allows me to focus on the things that I'm actually trying to do with the poem rather than the actual structure. So it's something that I think I've possibly overlooked, but for the right reasons. So that's really the way that I've tended to look at it.
Another thing you have in common in your work and life is displacement. And I was wondering whether Tom might say something about his relation with Ireland since he's there, and Irish poetry.
Well, thanks for the question. I came here for no other reason than in 1969 when they had the first of the Nixon draft lotteries. And I got a high number, so I wasn't going to be going to Vietnam. And I thought I was such a lackluster student, I better do something to make it seem like I was leading a meaningful life at 20. So I bought a ticket for Ireland because I knew that my grandmother continued to send holiday cards to Tommy and Nora Lynch on the banks of the River Shannon. And we were always told to pray for them. Don't forget, my grandfather would say over Thanksgiving dinners and whatever. And so when I came here in February of 1970, it was running from a lackluster scholarship at a state university and trying to vacate the premises so no one would catch on to the fact that my prospects were nothing. I had no money. I wasn't promising anything. So, but I came here and it changed my life, and I've never stopped coming back. And it's been over 50 years now. And
you have an Irish collection, don't you? The Sin Eater, which is one of the collections in this book.
I wanted to do it in Clare here because all of those episodes, there's 24 poems of 24 lines, like a book of hours, like a breviary. And they all take place on this West Clare Peninsula roughly between Kilrush and Loophead, a space that you can drive in 25 or 30 minutes. And it just keeps narrowing because of the ocean and the estuary. So the Sin Eater was a very good character for me. And I was grateful to Salmon for bringing them out there. So a little Catholic press run by nuns in Massachusetts called Paraclete Press did it in America. And I was glad of that because it's I like to have them on the record, and I'm glad to have several of them in this book. So thank you very much.
Andre, you are the poet of displacement par excellence. I was wondering whether you would like to say something about how you were affected by being thrown out of Abu Dhabi, amongst other places, and how that's affected your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Just as an introduction, I think my parents actually got together. My father's from Iran, my mother's from Italy, and they actually got together in the Emirates. And I should have really been born there, except for the fact that unmarried women weren't allowed to give birth there at the time. My parents got married around the time that I was 5 or 6 years old, and so that's why I was born in Italy. But yeah, in the UAE, I think, like in a lot of other countries of the Persian Arab Gulf, where the majority of the people in those countries, up to 90% in some cases, including the UAE, are foreigners. And one of the best descriptions I've ever heard really is by my one colleague from Abu Dhabi, really, the novelist Deepak Unnikrishnan, who called us, and by extension all the people from that part of the world, the migrants, temporary people. So that's all that we were in that part of the world, these temporary people. And I think at 18, I think this is still the case, but at 18, essentially you were faced with quite a dramatic choice, which was if you wanted to remain, but you could no longer stay under your parents' visa, you had to essentially get yourself a master. And a master would then provide you with a job, visa, and accommodation. And at 18, I may not have known much about the world, but I know I didn't want a master. I didn't want someone with that level of power over me. And so I think that, quite often, I've started to look at the concept of home as absolutely entirely molded by almost everyone except the individual, really. Home is what other people tell you it is, and it's always something that's always made me feel quite uncomfortable, really. So I think the fact that I've been quite often displaced, or that I haven't had a specific home, has made me a citizen of the world. Obviously, now these days that tends to get treated as quite a laughable concept, right? There was Theresa May saying, you know, if you're a citizen of everywhere, you're a citizen of nowhere, which is really one of the uglier statements someone could make. But it's been a real gift to me, I think, really. It's been something that's yielded most of what's worthwhile about my life, really. And so on the one hand, I think what begins as injustice can then turn into a gift. You know, that's certainly the way I've seen it. And I think, you know, supposedly I carry an Italian passport. I should really have an Iranian one too. My father's a political exile. There's a poem that I wrote in the book called The Last Communist, because that's what I used to think of him as. And yeah, I supposedly I have these ties to these countries, but I've never been to Iran. I almost never go to Italy. When I do, I can't wait till I leave. And I tend to find myself at home almost everywhere, except where I am supposed to be at home. And I think that's quite a healthy way to be, really.
And in your case, you came of age after leaving America as a poet. You came of age as a poet, in that I don't think you were necessarily a poet or writing much when you were in the States, but it was when you came here that you started really writing the kind of mature work that went into your first collection.
Yeah.
And although you drew upon your American upbringing in that first book, what I think's unusual about your work, as if you are an American poet, is that you're a wonderful observer of English, British people. You give a wonderful outsider insider perspective on a kind of comedy of manners in many of your poems.
Oh, thank you very much. British American, I'd say now, you know, I've got the dual citizenship, and yeah, I wrote not very good poems in high school in Springfield, Virginia. But yes, I always found this country very inspiring. The children's books, the Beatles, the incredible, you know, the first time you hear Penny Lane or you know, Eleanor Rigby or something like that, you just think, my God, this language, you know, so that love of language. And I mean, I'd obviously been exposed to some of that in high school, T.S. Eliot and Yeats, and being in the choir at church briefly, you know, the King James Bible and things. And I guess I just wanted to go to the source of the language in a way. So, yeah. Yeah, I think it feels more natural now. Maybe before it was a little bit touristy, but now I've been here since, you know, I was 17. So yeah. But I'm still really interested, and I'm really interested in the sort of Americas that I've had, you know, more exposure to with Thomas and Andre. Really interesting, just the different takes, you know, and the different landscapes. I just wanted to ask Andre, if I may, you abandoned, said one of your poems says you abandoned all cravings of permanence, but it happened when you came to the desert. And I just wondered, was it something special about the desert that made that happen? It seems like a sort of ground zero, you know. I don't know.
Yeah,
Is there a connection?
No, there is actually. Thank you. You know, I think one of the great inspirations for that project was I don't know if you may have come across his work, the great photographer Richard Misrak and his desert cantos, and there's these wonderful wide lens landscape photos of mostly the West and the Southwest, and there was something that appealed to me. You know, growing up in Arabia, I think finding myself at home in a desert, I think, was a foregone conclusion. And you know, I never realized that I would wind up in the US. You know, I was quite happily living my life in the UK, popping in and out as I tended to do, and living in other places. But I never thought I'd wind up in America. And so I found myself there. And there was something that really, yeah, I found quite liberating, because I think, you know, keeping with what I said earlier, I've always found the concept of home quite restrictive. There's this wonderful line in the German novelist Wolfgang Köppen where he calls home the cage called fatherland, which I think is a great line. But I think, yeah, it was there. There was something about the the beauty of the desert, which we keep trying to terraform in our own ridiculous ways. You know, I mean, one of the silliest things about LA, where I spent quite a few years, was their insistence on keeping these manicured lawns going, despite the fact that we're always living in it from one drought to the other. You know, and I think just the simplicity of the desert, the absence of a lot of human life there, I think allowed for that moment to happen. Where, yeah, I think now and again, despite myself, I would want to feel that I was permanently tied to places, but I think that's something that at least I feel right now I've cured myself of. And yeah, perhaps I think there's a link to that landscape. I think you're quite right. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, we like in these events to have the writers talking to each other about each other's books, and Anne has wonderfully kicked that off. I was wondering whether Andre or Tom have anything you want to say about each other's books. Anything you'd like to come in on?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, actually, if you don't mind, I had a question for you, Anne.
I'll ask one.
And I was wondering,
we'll go around in a circle. Yeah.
in what way history plays a role in
Sorry.
Oh, I just had a message pop up saying the connection was stable.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was unclear.
Yes, I'm having trouble hearing. Can people? Yeah.
We missed a bit of you. It's about what role history plays.
Right. What role history plays?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. It does. I mean, my major was history. Well, put it in the American parlance. Yeah, I read history at University of London. So yeah, I'm very conscious of it. I don't have the patience to do lots of research in it, you know, meticulous research. But yeah, I think I do. I think I'm at home with abstractions. I think I'm at home with broad movements. And I always like to look at, you know, a little bit of Marxism, a little bit of, you know, where things going, the shape of things, which is really funny because you have to be very precise to be a poet. So maybe trying to put those together makes quite short poems. But yeah, I think history definitely informs my thinking and what the way I look at things. And I notice it does with both of yours too. And I was going to ask Thomas, yeah, thank you for that. That was good. About, you know, you've got this sort of carnal, you had a line about the carnal and the incarnate, which I thought was a wonderful way of almost summarizing some of your poetry. And you know, there is a lot of religious reference. And I wondered, is that tied in with the Irishness to some degree? Do you think that really brought that to the fore for you, the you know, the religiosity, or is it's just such a rich fund of symbolism?
It's a very good question, Anne, because the Catholic Church in the United States is pretty much the Irish Catholic Church that inundated the East Coast in the, you know, the middle of the 19th century. And so the nuns and Christian brothers that I was educated by all had their footing in a very orthodox Irish Catholic theology, which was basically one of redemptive suffering. They're all trying to sort of get away from that now because they've figured out that it doesn't make much sense and that people aren't going for that, you know. But in those days, it was all, you kept a tally of your sins and what you had to do to bring things right. So confession and Eucharist and all those things were very important. Well, the first thing that any sentient human finds out is when they have sex, that the nuns were lying to them. And the Christian brothers just didn't know. And so it becomes a moment of very, very healthy secularization for most people. And for me, it meant that I find myself constantly shaking a fist in the face of a God I no longer believe in. So but somebody's in charge, and it's not Tom. So that's the only article of faith I have to keep. So it could be you, could be Andre, could be Neil, it doesn't matter. That cat that Neil has going back and forth, I think that's a high candidate in my line of work, because they have special connections,
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I do think the whole bodily thing, we keep our corpses up front. And that's basically the difference between the Catholic church and the Protestant church, is that our crucifix has the corpse on it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. That ties it together even more. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what Andre was saying about history also, Anne, is, a lot of your poems are about social change, aren't they? And about change. So you are responding very much to changing times in your work, as you all are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm trying to, well, one of the things is to sort of, think of the inspiring strand in history, think of there is some of that in Andre's work with the various little potted biographies, which I found really interesting. And it's like repeopling the present, repeopling the future, coming up with new mythologies, coming up with new, I don't know, even sound bites can help, I always think of little tiny phrases have made a big difference. I mean, the first person who came up with the phrase control freak, that just skewered a whole lot of people who needed to think about that, So history, we always think it's something very grand, but there's so many ways that history happens and evolution happens, So I'm very interested in that, yeah.
As I read your work, Anne, it seems to me that you make connections where we wouldn't automatically make a connection. And one of the astonishments of encountering your work is that it seems after we've come across the line where the bridge that makes the metaphor seems durable and we can get across it just fine, we think, why didn't I think of that? And I'm wondering. Because so much of it seems to be organic in its construction. I really admire that.
Oh,
do you just keep a list as you go through your days of the things that are going to turn to gold for you, or what? I mean, how do you do that, Anne?
That is a really good question. I can't quite think what I do. I mean, something. Well, you probably find this too. Something just grabs you. And then I sort of brainstorm, and then sometimes it just sits there and looks very flat, and you think, oh, okay, that's not going anywhere. Maybe I'll keep it. Maybe it'll be useful later. But I'm very big on the idea of a poem as opposed to poetry. I really like the idea of something that, and I saw that with Tony Hoagland very much, and you guys too. The poems turn. They have a beginning, a middle, at the end. They have an organic unity. So yeah, I wait for those moments, those epiphanies or whatever. I keep writing and taking notes, and then sometimes those two things coalesce, and then you have a sort of a load of notes around an epiphany. I mean, the other day I was in a National Express coach, for God's sake, but I started writing about things on the M5, and it just sort of started to come into something. I think you also have to be in good terms with your unconscious. And I have a mental health background. I was a mental health nurse, and worked for Mind, and then I had problems of my own, and so that all that, if you're open to that, I think it helps the stuff come up. I mean, you must have found that too, because I think
do you know though when you have it, when it rings true, do you know it in real time? This is the stuff I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think usually it'll just start doing that coalescing thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Where it starts to feel like it's turning on itself and it's going somewhere, and things start lighting up. But I'm you can see I'm not writing very long poems, so I'm throwing away stuff too, and
it's mostly subtraction, isn't it?
Yes. And I'm working on things which, then I get rid of. I mean, poor Neil, he had to deal with me when this book was being put together, you know. I was sort of, oh, no, you know. So, you know, it's a very evolving thing. Well, you probably find the same, both of you. But yeah, I think it's just those particular moments of intensity in a given set of phenomena, you know, and that intensity must come from the unconscious, where else, you know. So, but
I like the way you use the word epiphany also, because I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Suddenly we see things as they are.
Yeah, that's right. And why, but it's very interesting when people start writing public things, you know, things which are about histories and movements, because then you've got another rhythm going there, the sort of epic rhythm, you know, and I'm really interested in how they mesh, you know, how do you get those longer forms, the narratives, the epic, you know, in it sort of somehow having something to do with the lyric. Very interesting, that. I mean, I've been writing short stories actually where I've been doing that. So, yeah. So, yeah.
Thomas, I've actually got a question for you. Earlier, you know, we the concept of poetry is this heightened form of speech was brought up, you know, and it's something that perhaps a lot of people shy away from, but that they inevitably have to face. Usually, you know, as we all know, they tend to come across them at weddings or births, funerals. And given what you've done with your work throughout your life, I wondered, has that, I think, really helped you not necessarily write more, but think more poetically? Do you find, or did it, you know, did the specificities of the job sort of not lead you down that path, and perhaps it was, you know, something that you took to in a way that someone else would take to a perhaps less dramatic job? Let's put it that way.
I think it was Yeats who was writing a letter to some woman he was chatting up, and he said the only thing that a serious mind should occupy a serious mind are either sex or death. And I can remember as a young man thinking, how nice for me, because I approve of sex, and the dead seem to be everywhere, you know, because of my family's line of work. And I came to understand that being sort of mortality adjacent, it didn't give me any coupons. I had a daughter die of suicide early in this pandemic, and there was no coupon that said this won't hurt for me because you've been doing this all your life, you know. But I can say that being mortality adjacent to the needs of my community, and the dead were everywhere, and the what to do part of it, the done thing part of it, was never a mystery to me. And I'm grateful for that, because I think a lot of people feel, Andre, as if they've got to reinvent the wheel, and they better do it before tomorrow comes, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I sometimes think that poetry as a done thing, as a constructed thing, as a made thing, is not unlike the sort of ritual construct of a good wedding or a good funeral or a good baptism. Because you need a baby, a body, and bodies for all of those things, you know. And ours is really the first generation that has tried, at least insofar as funerals are concerned, to have the so-called celebration of life, to which everyone is welcome except the dead guy. You know, we farm that out. We have them disappeared by somebody like me, and I think that's a big mistake. It's like getting rid of the baby before the baptism, you know.
I think we should have them early. Have them while the person's still alive and celebrate. You know, tell them everything you wanted to tell
Well,
them.
public hangings would work too. We could have a good, you know, it would do the job. I think people would take it more seriously, you know.
I think on that note, we should hang up this event. It's been wonderful discussion, wonderful readings. So thank you, Anne, Andre, and Tom, for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Do go on to the links and get hold of the books. And we'll just say our goodbyes to you, including my little friend here, who's been trying to get involved in the reading. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you,
For being
Neil.
part of tonight's
Thank
event.
you, Neil.
Thank you.
A pleasure, Anne, Thomas.